The theory of general relativity. 2 words. Amazingly amazeballs. I mean, let's give it up for Albert Einstein for coming up with yet another thing that we can barely comprehend. Luckily for you, I read up on the Physics for Dummies book and can give you a simplified understanding. Published in 1916, the theory of general relativity assumes that everything in the observable universe is connected through gravitational attractions. This caused a wave of sociologists in the 1960s to try and prescribe this same affinity, but for humans, equating all of us to be the same. To my 8-year-old mind, that only meant one thing and one thing only. I could be Kim Kardashian. I mean, the resemblance is uncanny. Even at 8 years old, I was destined to mesh different circumstances into a figmented reality, which barely scratched the surface of actuality. I mean, for heaven's sake, my butt's not even that big enough to be at the Kardashian level. But I soon realized this mistake has become human nature, that we, more often than not, oversimplify matters through unequal equivalences. This idea was coined in 1963 in Peter Berger's publication The Invitation to Sociology as the relativization motif, the phenomenon in which humans prescribe their social location to create stringent meaning systems without taking into account other thoughts. Though this seems desirable in the advent of paving bridges for our differences, it is instead given rise to jeopardizing comparisons. Comparisons which threaten to erase the depth of problems and people. And this is my concern. In order to understand this social disparity, let's first examine the rise of relativization, then discuss its impacts on the real world, before finally pinpointing how we can reverse its negative implications. Now, the general theory of relativity assumes that everything is controlled under the independent variable of gravity. Similarly, in the social circumstance, it implies there is an overarching culture which prescribes thought processes, ethical codes of conduct, and philosophies. Though many will be quick to argue that there are no such stipulations, Felicia Prato of the University of Connecticut would kindly disagree. She frames that in the West, Eurocentric colonial ideals have shaped the way we feel about certain issues. Prato named this idea the social dominance orientation. This theory postulates the society's attempt to minimize group conflict by creating consensus on ideologies that promote the superiority of one group over another, masking an illusion of normality. Thus, when something seems off-putting, we're quick to relativize them, in accordance to what we already know, for it to make sense. For example, last year when I went to a Persian restaurant, I overheard a woman ordering her food. She asked for chickpea fritters with chickpea chip dip, instead of just asking for falafel and hummus. She was quick to relativize the name of a traditional Middle Eastern delicacy to cater to her Western palate. But this issue also transcends into greater proximities. For example, when 3 years ago, then Illinois Governor Bruce Rauner went up to a Say's and chugged a glass of chocolate milk and saying, and I quote, diversity, relativizing the matter of racism to merely the color of milk. The social dominance complex has created a hierarchy which has prescribed hyper-westernized ideas of normality, a normality which unfortunately oversimplifies problems and people. Thus, those who have benefited from the system fail to take accountability by continuously relativizing situations to their own lives, instead of learning. Now, my relativization strand was not pulled out of my head, much like Einstein's, but instead imprinted in elementary school. Growing up in New York, we would take large pieces of construction paper and go outside while it was snowing and catch snowflakes to look at through a magnifying glass. The moral of the story? We're all different, baby! But then we would melt the snowflakes, symbolizing how at the end of the day we are all human. This counterintuitive connection, however, failed to recognize the differences of people with the differences of experiences. Take the model minority myth, which lumps over 300 Asian ethnic groups into one. Introduced in 1966 by William Peterson, This idea influenced articles such as Newsweek's Outriding the Whites in 1971. This article, along with many others, sensationalized the argument. If Asians can work hard and never complain, why aren't other racial groups following suit? But what reveled was how Peterson aimed to use the model minority to relativize the impacts of racism, divide Asian Americans from communities of color, and ultimately perpetuate anti-blackness. This highlights the problem of reductiveness when discussing relativization. And we even saw this just last month when TV pundit Candace Owens was quick to liken the domestic terror attack on January 6th on the Capitol to the Black Lives Matter protest in the summer of 2020. Her comparison itself was fallacious, relativizing the frustration over a losing candidate in a fair election to systemic oppression and police brutality against people of color for hundreds of years. Her statements were A, an oversimplification of the problems at hand, and B, a straw man comparison to support one side. Because she, as a black woman herself, has never experienced racism. She believed that it ceased to exist in the United States. But I don't even need to overblow relativization for us to see it in our daily lives. How often do we come across these self-proclaimed scientists debunking global warming, citing the evidence that it's cold outside, to even 1 in 3 Americans believing that the root of poverty relies on laziness and no other ulterior factor, or how the Department of Health and Human Services redefined the term gender in a binary manner, eliminating the federal protections for transgender individuals, to even how the College Board relativizes student academic excellence to standardized testing. Relativization aims to make everything equal in the eyes of a single entity, when in reality, those same simple underscore solutions have depth tainted into them, which simply cannot be rationalized in a single view. The harm I fear the most is the dichotomy of either or answers, a dichotomy that impacts us greatly, myself included. Growing up as a Muslim Asian immigrant, it was far too often that my entire life would be boiled down to the existence of the discoloration of my skin, the feminine quality of my voice, or the lack of mental health outlets because I was expected to be well, simply because I was Asian. These assumptions, injected with bias, caused crippling effects. Luckily for us, we have Albert Einstein, who not only proposed general relativity, but gave a solution to its sociological imprints. When he iterated, just as everything is connected, everything is just as disconnected, condensing the mathematical application of reciprocity. So, how do we stop relativizing? Well, we have to partake in it more. Confusing? I know, but bear with me. Relativization is the social phenomenon of looking at things from a relative perspective. But if we are to scope things out, we can actually engage in multiple nodes of relativization in a practice collectively named cultural moral relativism. According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, this practice facilitates questioning as a method of learning instead of using subjective societal ideals. In a world that seems to be all-knowing, questioning is seen as courageous, when in fact it should be the norm. We are not perfect people in a perfect world, so questioning allows us the avenue to understand every phrase evoked from one's mouth, as they come from the confirmations of society, experiences, and outlooks. Thus, every idea is significant, whether you agree with them or not. When we rely on questioning, we break open the doors and come closer to understanding ambiguity, but not too close because we are in a pandemic, social distance, and also break down the idea of centrism. So I implore everyone, ask questions, get curious, try to learn instead of trying to persuade. It's the only way of coming to a consensus on the diversity of issues and people we have in this world. Now I know, it's disappointing. We can't look at things from a single lens because, hello, I wanted to be Kim Kardashian. But this highlights the beauty of differences. I'm the only me just as you are the only you. And that's not something that we can change, but only grow from. We have to stop prioritizing the belief that we are all bound together in an idiosyncratic manner, which lavishes at oversimplifications and assumptions. Because though we are human, our stories, experiences, and lives have been completely different. Using one perception to justify another cannot be the reason of how we create a more harmonious community. It's time we open our minds and instead relativize the fact that we are all different, and that's the only thing binding us together today.